Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. So I'm doing a very hotly suggested video, and today is Tuesday, December 18th. Usually I do that right before the video, 2018, but today we're going to be going through a 2020 Democratic primary election prediction between Senator Bernie Sanders and Vice President Joe Biden. So again, this is very hotly requested, considering that these are the top two names for the 2020 election. Beto O'Rourke was thrown in there a couple of times, but I've decided to settle on just a one-on-one prediction between these two, considering that's the best thing that can be represented. I chose Sanders to be represented by the Democrats, of course, with the symbolic blue, and then Biden with the red, just because he's a little bit more moderate in terms of some issues, so I feel like that's a little bit better in terms of representing him, and it's just a color, to be completely honest with you. However, just looking at the overall electoral map, what I'm not going to be including is delegates. I do not have an accurate, delegate counter for each individual state until there is actually one. I'm probably going to try to find someone who can make me one, and I don't know exactly how much that will be, considering that it'd probably cost not a lot, but I guess I would say a little bit, considering you have to customize each individual state in terms of making it proportionate, and then have one for the Republican primaries if there is any, but there probably won't be. Just overall, that's a new system that I'd probably try to invest into. So today we're going to be using the exact electoral map from 270towin.com. The way that I'm going to be using this map, this is going to be purely based off winning, side. Biden or Sanders win, and essentially there's not going to be any margins. I'm not going to include margins on this map because I don't know enough about each individual state to make a clear conclusion. Yes, for presidential elections, I've been doing that for the past 3 years. 2 years, actually. For this channel, a year. But looking at the overall, electoral map, it's a pretty accurate representation in terms of population. You know that New York's going to have for more delegates for the Democrats than South Dakota. You just know that based off that. So if Sanders wins in South Dakota and Biden wins in New York, you know that Biden's probably ahead. And again, that 270 number does not really matter, considering that some states, although they have equal amounts of electoral votes, are valued a little bit more amongst Democrats in terms of pledged delegates. So that's also something to take into account. But this is just a general idea of how certain states will go in a Sanders versus Biden map. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the first couple of states. Now, back in 2016, there was a great divide just around halfway through the country. You know, you take the Sun Belt, California, you just cut all the way through the half, and you go up into the Northeast, and the rest of the area was Sanders territory, and then the rest of this bottom part was Clinton territory. And you really could see why in terms of demographics. You look at the wider population over here, the more, minority Democratic population down here, and you see it's very clear. Bernie Sanders does very well against white voters. Joe Biden does very well amongst minority voters and also some white voters, but that doesn't necessarily put him at the advantage to Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has since gotten a lot more name recognition that he didn't have in 2016, and he's been able to convince a lot of people to, in turn, vote for him for 2020. Again, looking at the preliminary election polls, which again, were not too accurate in 2016, but it's the only data we have now, it just goes to show that it is possible for a Bernie Sanders victory, especially considering that he does very well amongst minority groups, as expected for a Democratic candidate. Now, we're going to go ahead and start off with the respective home states, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and then Vermont, because I'm not going to decide between Delaware and Pennsylvania just for right now, but I'm going to give Biden Delaware and Pennsylvania. These are two states that I think he could be very solid in, especially coming from Pennsylvania and then serving as a senator in Delaware. There's no way he loses these states, to be completely honest with you, and we all know Bernie Sanders is not going to lose the state of Vermont. Now, that puts Biden in a pretty good lead for right now, but again, that's only 3 states, and they also include primaries from Puerto Rico, from Guam, and overall, those are just something that we're going to discuss. When I refer to a caucus as a primary, I'm just using the term primary as general primary election term. I really do not want to go into each individual state and say Iowa caucus goes to, once we get there, I'll say who I think the victor will be. But again, if I say a state that has normally a caucus as a primary, it's just me blanketing the entire thing as a primary because these are the Democratic primaries, even though they may have caucuses, and yes, they do impact the outcome of the elections. I will take that into account, but I'll still probably refer to it as a primary, just a little bit of vocabulary issues that you guys may have in these videos. If you're not even watching this part, then you probably won't know. I know I'm going to see a comment about it. But we'll go ahead and start up in the Northeast because this is an interesting area for me. This is an area that I didn't think would be too good for Hillary Clinton. Looking at the overall area that Bernie Sanders comes from, sure, Hillary Clinton comes from New York, but to be completely honest with you, her best base is in the South for good reason. I mean, there's a huge minority population in the South. Up in the Northeast, yeah, some minorities do vote, but it isn't mainly minorities. Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, stereotyped as white states, and they aren't wrong. I mean, we're looking at these states, and they do have a pretty large white population, and they do vote Democratic most of the time. And that really does make sense just based off certain issues that affect the Northeast. But I do think states like New Hampshire we're going to have to come back to, but Maine I do think could go to Bernie Sanders, especially with that whole new voting reform thing. That's something that I definitely see Bernie Sanders backing. The state of Maine itself, I think, would, of course, not divided by congressional districts in a primary, goes to Bernie Sanders. And then looking at the rest of the Northeast, I would say New Hampshire I'm going to come back to because I'm not entirely sure as to how that state will go yet. I think Massachusetts could narrowly go to Bernie Sanders, and yes, I do see Joe Biden appealing a little bit better than Hillary Clinton in some states. Massachusetts, again, I do think Biden can do a little bit better amongst white voters, but I do think Sanders' has more larger appeal to the Northeast has since grown. His influence has grown. Sphere of influence across the United States definitely has grown since the 2016 presidential primaries, in which he only narrowly lost the state of Massachusetts. For the state of Connecticut, I would say that one narrowly goes to Joe Biden, whereas Rhode Island goes to Bernie Sanders, and that puts him about even with no, again, we're not going through electoral votes, but just in terms of reference, 486 electoral votes to go. Now, we go over to some of these big population states. New York and New Jersey I do think could go to Joe Biden. I really see that Clinton population that voted for her before coming out for him this time around, along with a couple more white, I guess, doing better amongst white voters, white Democratic voters, obviously, especially with these states being Democratic strongholds. Love the establishment in both of these states. No real reason why Joe Biden should lose it, along with Maryland and Virginia. I mean, he's running up the map here, winning in D.C., especially with states with heavy African-American populations. This is just solid territory for Joe Biden. And once we get to the South, you'll see exactly how solid this territory has become for these type of Democrats. As for West Virginia, that one just goes solidly for Bernie Sanders. Although the exit poll data did show that they wanted a more conservative president amongst Democratic voters, voting for Bernie Sanders may not exactly be their ideal. They did not like Hillary Clinton whatsoever, but I do think that he could win in the state of West Virginia. I don't think it'll be as large of a margin because he isn't going against Hillary Clinton. I just don't know if Joe Biden can sweep back, especially with a bunch of progressive candidates taking over a number of races in terms of the Democratic primary. Seems very likely Bernie Sanders can take the win there. Now, going over to Ohio and Kentucky, and again, just filling in the Deep South for right now, the African American population, when I tell you how large it is large. This is an area that has done so much good for Clinton, for Obama, for previous Democratic candidates. This is an area that they really need to capitalize on, and Bernie Sanders is not doing that. To be completely honest with you, yes, sure, he walked in the civil rights movement, but do they know that? The answer is no. The African-American population here has stuck behind the Clintons, they stuck behind Obama's legacy, and now they will stick behind Joe Biden because he is closely intertwined to both of those candidates. If they did successful wins here, of course that he's going to have a successful win here, especially with him being able to appeal to Latinos, to African-American voters, just based on the fact he was the vice president for Obama. And that's something that he's going to ride upon. Continuing the Obama legacy that Trump, quote-unquote, interrupted, I think that's going to be the main forefront of his campaign. And that's going to be something that's really going to propel him in a number of these, quote-unquote, key Democratic states in the primaries. Especially if he chooses someone like Beto O'Rourke for his vice presidential nominee. Speaking of Beto O'Rourke, we go over to the state of Texas. Joe Biden does not lose the state of Texas. This is an area that has done very well for Democratic candidates in the past. And to be completely honest with you, in terms of primaries, in terms of establishment Democrats, Bernie Sanders is still not an establishment Democrat, although he is as establishment as you get in terms of being in Congress for as long as he has been. But right now, I would say the state of Texas goes to Joe Biden. Again, these states are very, very nice to these more moderate type of Democrats, and it's really expected, again, being a part of the South with a heavy minority population that votes in the Democratic primaries. It makes sense, to be honest with you. But going up across the quote-unquote red wall, this is Sanders territory. Okay, looking at a number of these states, even South Dakota, which went to Clinton in 2016, could very well go to Bernie Sanders. Going over to Washington and Oregon, huge progressive population here. If you look in Oklahoma, flipped a House seat in 2018. Kansas flipped House seat in 2018. Close House seat in Nebraska. Close House seat in Montana. Okay, flipped House seat in Washington. We're looking at areas that have different types of Democrats, mainly progressive Democrats, who have done pretty well in terms of the, I guess, overall, what would you say, not really Midwest, I guess, center of the country. Again, going up across that part of the red wall, I think could do very well for Bernie Sanders. States like Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan, although I do think that Biden can appeal to them in the general election, I do think that Bernie Sanders will hold on to that progressive population, especially with him being particularly underestimated in these individual states. Now, for Indiana, I think that one could go to Bernie Sanders, but Missouri being a part of the South, I would say, I mean, that's arguable, but still, Missouri, I would say, would go to Joe Biden, along with the state of Illinois. I just think that propulsion, that energy behind him from the Democratic Party is enough to land him over the victory in the state of Iowa. Going over to the state of New Hampshire, I would give that one to Bernie Sanders because I do think he could narrowly win in that scenario. Again, Bernie Sanders, although he may be a better candidate in terms of electability, which is, again, another argument for another day, you can't draw the general conclusion that he's going to win, the primaries just based off that. Yeah, Hillary Clinton did pretty much prop that one up as that she would be the most electable candidate, which may or may not have been true based off what if Bernie Sanders was the, general election nominee in 2016. But Bernie Sanders, even though that may be his argument, he's not going to jump on that. He's going to focus on his more campaign reform, progressive reform. And to be completely honest with you, I think that's going to be something that really is going to hurt him. The Democratic Party, although they did take steps to get rid of superdelegates, they are still a Clinton base at heart. This is a party that has backed these Clinton-type candidates, and it becomes news that a progressive candidate wins an election. If this is such a large party, population of the party, it shouldn't be news that a progressive wins. And yeah, again, you should applaud them when they're able to defeat incumbent Democrats, like what happened in New York's 14th district. It may have been 14th district, or it may have been his 14th term. I might be Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's district. Overall, looking at the Democratic Party itself, it doesn't have that large of a progressive population. Again, looking at the 2016 primaries, Hillary Clinton got 55% of the vote. Bernie Sanders got 43%. When you look at that alone, it doesn't look like he's getting such... yes, he's getting 43% of the vote, but how many of those voters were actually true progressives? How many of them just voted for him because they wanted to vote for someone other than Hillary Clinton? Keep that in mind. When it comes down to these individual candidates, Joe Biden may be that breath of fresh air, or Bernie Sanders may be, but at the end of the day, these Democratic Party voters are a lot more intertwined in terms of establishment Democrats and loving them more than the Bernie Sanders population of the Democratic Party, which is why Bernie Sanders' main appeal is that he can appeal to independents. Well, what do most of these states with the Democratic primary have? Closed primary. So these independents' voices are not getting heard, which makes sense considering that it is a Democratic primary. But again, in terms of electability, after the primaries, they always get more moderate, and then, of course, independents will pick and choose each side. But for right now, Joe Biden is in the lead in terms of winning this winning this primary, based off the fact that he has done very well in terms of appeal. Already, even though he may or may not run, you already know he's going to be backed by all those Obama voters, a number of those Clinton voters, and possibly some Sanders voters. The only real areas where I do see Bernie Sanders really improving on for right now are states like South Dakota, Massachusetts, even across a couple of these other states. It's really hard to make a general conclusion. Florida, I'm about to fill in for Joe Biden. And the reason behind that is, yes, Andrew Gillum won here. But, looking at that margin, it wasn't exactly the largest margin. Sure, he went from polling in fourth to first. But Bernie Sanders had a very bad showing here in 2016. Again, when it comes down to a two-candidate race, getting 34% of the vote and still winning the primary does not mean a lot. For the case in Maryland, where Ben Jealous won by 34% of the primary, it was a big upset, but then lost the general election by double digits. I'm not saying that's going to happen for Bernie Sanders, especially in a state like Florida, but does definitely need some further looking into. New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada, I think these are states that could go to Joe Biden at this moment. I do think Joe Biden could do very well across these Sunbelt states, but California, that is the big one. And, California, although in the past they have voted with Hillary Clinton, they voted with Barack Obama, Joe Biden, with this state being voted on so early on, this is not late in the election. After all of these primaries happen, you would expect California to happen, and then it would go red. But at this point, I think that it could go to Bernie Sanders. I think with all this energy behind both campaigns, I think they're going to focus a lot of their time on California, especially with new types of Democrats getting elected in a number of these more conservative districts like Orange County, with all those districts turning from red to blue. I do think this new type of progressive wave that we're going to see possibly in 2020 could lapse onto California, but we're just not seeing it in the establishment states like New York, Pennsylvania, Florida. These states that have deep embedded roots for these establishment candidates. California, you may or may not be able to say the same, especially with this state being so open to change. I really think Bernie Sanders could be their quote-unquote their candidate. So that wraps up this video. I don't know why my voice is sounding weird at the end of the video. I guess it's because I've been talking for like 14 minutes. But again, that wraps up today's video. Thank you guys for watching this video. Comment down suggestions below, and I'll see you all tomorrow.